Welcome back to the LED Project podcast. My name is Kyle Krieger. I'm thrilled tonight on the podcast to be joined by Trevor Muir. Trevor, how are you?
Doing good, Kyle. How are you doing tonight?
I'm excellent. I'm excellent. We just got done talking a little bit. I'm in the last home stretch of my last week with kids, so I'm doing well. It's been a crazy year. I've been back almost a full year from Texas, so it's been a wild year.
Yeah, there's something really bittersweet about this time of year. Um, so I teach mostly high school seniors, and they all graduated last week. And so part of me is like, yes, summer, freedom, rest,
Right.
canoeing. And then the other part's like, gosh, like, I'm going to miss these kids. I'm not going to see most of them ever again unless I run into them at the grocery store. Like they're off, and so there's something. And when you're getting really invested in what you're doing, there's this feeling come summer that's really excited, and then also like, wow, this is kind of the end of another chapter. So I'm with
Right.
you though. I'm
Right.
excited.
Yeah. I started teaching. My career in Texas was I guess 9 years ago now. And I had seventh graders, and now I have them like they found me on Facebook, and they're like 22, and they're like getting married and stuff. And I'm just like, oh my, I can't believe how fast that's gone. So, what are you doing now that all the seniors are gone? Do you still have to be at school?
I just have to be there. I teach one group of freshmen in high school, so I've got them for at 8 to 9 a.m. And then the rest of the day I think and compile data. Those are
Right.
the official things I'm doing. But I'm actually just getting a little bit of rest. But I do still have to be at school, so I'm spending that time writing and creating and working some of the other stuff I do outside of the classroom.
Perfect, perfect. All right, so the podcast, what we want to do is just bring on teachers to let them tell their story with the hopes, that they would inspire other teachers, but also like start to paint a picture of what's really going on in education in our country. Because there's, a lot of times there's a negative connotation or negative perception of teachers and education, but we want to start to kind of change that. So to get us started, could you just tell us a little bit of your backstory and why it is that you became a teacher?
Absolutely. So when I was in middle school, I had a really, really rough period of life. I mean, for one, it was middle school. Are you with me? Uh,
Yep.
yeah. You're a middle school teacher, right?
No, I have high school kids.
Oh, you used to teach seventh
Yeah,
grade.
used to teach seventh grade.
Okay. So you know the struggle of middle schoolers.
Right.
Sixth grade, it was like this super awkward period of my life. It was the year my parents split up, which it often seems to happen at sixth grade is that really tough time of life. And so I was just like lost. I remember I had this one teacher in sixth grade who and I know like as a teacher now, I don't think this is what he was doing, but as a sixth grader, I felt like he was doing everything he could to make my life miserable. You know, and again, as a teacher, I'm like, no, that's not what teachers do. But as a sixth grader, I felt like he always wanted to make me pay for being a wild, lost, insecure little sixth grade, 12-year-old boy. Um, and so that really, really was a difficult part of my life, and especially the aspect that math teacher brought to me. But at the same time, I had this other teacher, and his name was Mr. Peters, and I absolutely love this guy. As I said, my parents split up that year. And I remember every single day, Mr. Peters would sit down at the end of class, and he would like close his door and not let other kids come in, and he would just talk to me. And he talked to me about my parents splitting up, and he told me how his parents split up, and he would talk about that and kind of just dive into it with me. We'd sometimes talk about girls or football, but it was like the first time a teacher really like poured into me in a way that nobody else in my life was pouring into me at that time. Um, and here we are, gosh, 10, 20 years later, and I'm an English teacher. Are you with me? And
Yeah.
like he had such a profound influence on me that this relationship he built with me carried on to the other aspects of this class. I poured my heart and soul into making this guy happy, and that meant I did really well in English, and I really learned how to write that year, and I got into grammar and all the other stuff that he was teaching. But he started off with this relationship first, and this experience with Mr. Peters stuck with me for a long, long time. And so, towards the end of college, it was kind of, well, what do I want to do? Um, and the only skill I could really identify that time was my ability to communicate. I love to write and I love to speak. And there wasn't a whole lot of avenues, or at least in that point in my life, to do anything with that other than, help others learn how to write and speak. And so I decided to be a teacher, kind of going off the mold of what Mr. Peters was to me, and really having this idea in mind that I want to be that teacher who builds relationships with kids first, then can find ways to get them interested in doing English and history and all the other things that I've taught. So that's kind of my origin story, and then a lot has happened since then, but that was the true motivation originally.
Yeah, it's so funny, and I can remember back to my story, and I hear kids talk about it now in the high school. They talk about how they think they were just good in that teacher's class, like Mr. Peters. They thought that somehow he was, just good, or they were just good. That was their good content, but it's really that relationship to where, that as a student you want to fight for that, and you want to do, like you said, do everything to make that person happy. And the funny part is, one of my teachers that I had in high school that was that person for me, actually, when I decided to move back, got me a job in his school district that he had moved to.
So did you reconnect with him?
Well, actually, like, he was a history and econ and sociology teacher at my high school. And then I was picking a college, and he knew I was going into education. He was like, "Hey, you should go to the school I went to." So I went through the same program he went through, and he was living in my hometown, so I would see him, when I was back, and just kind of bounce ideas and talk about professors, and then kept in touch with him while I was in Texas, and then he had been one of those people, at that point when you're your late 20s to 30, it's more of like a friendship thing, because he and his wife are in their early 40s. But he had just been for years. He'd been like, "Come on, we got something. We'll find you something. You can move back. You can come back." And when I said I was thinking about it, he's like, "I'll keep my eye open," and it fell right into place for me.
Well, something I find so interesting is that the work of a teacher is pretty temporary. The time that we actually spend with kids, like Mr. Peters, and I'm not saying that I wasn't important to him, but I was one student out of his 150 students for 1 year of his entire career. And my guess is that, as a matter of fact, I do remember Mr. Peters telling me in 6th grade, "I can't wait to come to high school graduation." And then the night I graduate, I look out into the crowd, there's Mr. Peters sitting right in front of me. So there was this long-term connection, but for him it was this very little blip. And I sometimes wonder if he and other teachers realize, how monumental they are in kids' lives. The teacher who, I mean, like you said, I guess you guys became friends in a way and built a deeper relationship. But I'm sure he had a much more profound impact on where you are now because of how much he helped you get into this career, than he ever imagined he would when you were a kid sitting in his class. You know what I mean? Like, I just went to my senior's graduation party this last weekend. A kid who was, he was in my class, and we talked as much as we could, but he was a very quiet boy. And he just would sit there and kind of, laugh when he heard jokes, and sometimes get into it, but for the most part, kept to himself. And I was at this graduation party, and he gave me a note. And I took it home, and I opened up, and I read it. It was just this big, long thing about the impact I had on his life, and his thank you, and all this. And I felt like, I was telling my wife, I was like, I feel bad. Because it's like, I don't feel like I poured nearly enough into that kid. But clearly I did in some way. You know what I mean? Like, clearly an impact happened that I really didn't realize. And I think about all the students we as teachers interact with. Like, how many kids are we impacting that we have no idea? Or maybe not even like a big monumental, you were my favorite teacher ever, but had some type of way of changing their trajectory, or pointing them in a certain direction, or planting a seed that sprouts later on, and maybe they don't even realize it. But I do think there's something very profound about the impact teachers have on students.
Yeah, and the funny thing, I was just going to ask you the question of what do you think the value of a great teacher is? So what would you say, like, the value of a great teacher is?
I think the best teachers are the ones who see a student as a person before an obtainer of content. As a student even, but actually seeing them as a person who's entering their classroom with a story, one that they're living out, um, that was already going before the teacher entered their life. And so when teachers realize that a kid is coming to their classroom with a story, with all these different experiences, and when the teacher recognizes that, they can do incredible things. I had this one student named Sarah who was just constantly falling asleep in my class this one day. And I remember the first time I went and gently, I woke her up and I said, Sarah, I need you to wake up. And she picked up her head and rubbed her eyes and said, sorry, Mr. Muir. And then 10 minutes later, I look and I'm going on with my class, I'm talking to my students, I'm up front, and I look back there and Sarah's sleeping again. And so I walk over and a little bit louder, I say, Sarah, I need you to wake up. She does the same thing, rubs her eyes, gets up. Well, the third time, like 10 minutes later, I see her, she's sleeping again. And this time I'm like, okay, I need to make an example of this girl because clearly being nice isn't working for her. So I said in a loud voice from across the room, intentionally, I said, Sarah, I need you to wake up. She picks her head up, and her face turns bright red, and she's embarrassed, and she rubs her eyes. She says, I'm sorry. And for the rest of the class, she kept her head up. And I'm thinking, like, man, you know how to teach, right? Like, you've got this pedagogy down. You know how to get this girl engaged. And you made an example because nobody else is sleeping in your class today. And then at the end of class, I went up to Sarah and I asked her, Sarah, why are you sleeping so much in class today? Why aren't you working? And she apologizes. And she says, oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Muir. I had to call 911 last night because my little sister's inhaler ran out and she had a bad asthma attack. So I had to ride with her to the hospital because my dad was working late. And my dad picked me up this morning and took me to school. And it was like this, like, spear to the chest, like it was, as a teacher, you're like, whoa, I didn't know. I didn't know that was what your life looked like outside of this place. I didn't know you didn't have a mom. I didn't know your dad works third shift and that you take care of your little sister. And so obviously, that day I apologized to Sarah and I said, I'm sorry. And she said, oh, no, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have fallen asleep in your class. I'm like, Sarah, I would have fallen asleep in my class too if that was my story. It was like this big wake-up call because this was in the beginning of my teaching career. But it was like this moment where I realized that Sarah isn't just this blank slate coming into my class ready to absorb whatever it is I want to teach her. She's living out this story, and she's got all these experiences, and I have to recognize that. I got to realize that she's not here she's here because she has to be here. And I've got to find a way to engage her in spite of all that she's living through. And that's a big part of what I do as a teacher is build those relationships now and learn those stories, but also find ways, how can I utilize them in the classroom? How can I, take the fact that Sarah spends a lot of time by herself and works with her hands and is a really hard worker in her own way. How can I utilize that into what my students are actually doing in class? How can I give her opportunities to work with her hands and pull pieces of her story into English class? So I think, in my opinion, and the best teachers in my life did that too, I think the best teachers find ways to utilize and recognize their students' stories. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's perfect. And it kind of led me into the next question I wanted to ask you about. We all know that, or at least I shouldn't say we all. I feel like there are times where it's really difficult to do what you just said and see students as people when the culture of education at times makes them kind of not people. You really have to see them as numbers. So how do you in the culture that we have strive and work to make sure you're seeing those kids as people?
Sometimes I have to get in a little bit of trouble. To me, I spend the first week of every school year, and it doesn't matter what class I'm teaching, whether it's AP, honors, regular, special education, I spend the entire first week doing nothing but team building and relationship building. And sometimes it's saying, hey, write. So sometimes we do Englishy stuff, but sometimes it's saying, hey, write to me and tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about your story. Tell me about your family. Sometimes it's I take my students outside of my classroom. We go for a hike in the woods, and there's not a whole lot of academic merit to that, other than the fact that my kids are learning that they can be comfortable around me, that we can have fun together. That when you come to my class, it's not just about the content. it's also about enjoying our time together. And so, I spent a whole first week doing that kind of stuff. And sometimes I get pushback from it. Um, hey, why aren't you diving right into curriculum? Is there a whole lot of merit to taking them outside? When you have students build towers with popsicle sticks and have these big competitions, how are you tying that to the Common Core? And sometimes I get in a little trouble. Sometimes I just have to find ways to tie content in. To go to your question, how do you build these relationships in spite of all what the systems around us? Sometimes you just have to be really creative. That girl Sarah, I found out that she loved to knit. That was one of the things she did with her spare time. And so we did this big, awesome history project where students were able to form their own businesses to raise money to give to this charity. And Sarah got really into knitting these hats that we sold, or that she sold. And she got to do it. And I gave her some class time to do it. She went home and she'd spend hours at home knitting these hats for this big service project. And in the midst of all that, we wrote papers about it. They had to write historical fiction narratives about the work they were doing. And then they were in MLA format. And we found ways to tie in the expository and formative writing that's in the Common Core. And so we still tied in the content. My students are still taking the SAT. They're still having to take final exams that are commonly shared throughout the English department at my school. But I try to find ways to engage students in spite of all that. I love to have fun, but I also really want them to learn the English skills. Still want them to learn the history and all these things that I consider important, but I never lead with that stuff. I try to lead with the relationships and the engagement and the stories, and then tie the content in afterwards.
Yeah.
Secondary.
Yeah. And it's kind of down my list, but I'm gonna bring it up because we're talking about it. I just saw your video and kind of your poem of school doesn't have to look like this anymore. Could you talk a little bit? Because I thought that was such a powerful piece.
I say in that video, is it the one with my son?
Uh,
3-year-old son, school doesn't have to look like this anymore.
yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So I've got a 4-year-old son. He was 3 when I made the video, but he's 4, and we went canoeing this weekend, and every 3 minutes on that canoe trip, he's asking me questions about things and how the world works. Daddy, what are rocks made of? Why does the river move? Why is it cooler in the shade? Why are frogs? All these different questions. He's so inquisitive about everything. He just wants to know everything about how the world works, and there's nothing he's not open to learning. And then I've got high school seniors, and so many of them want nothing to do with formal learning in any way. When my son will sit down and he will sit there and want to learn how to draw out letters and write letters. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I've got students that just can't wait to get out of our education system. And that breaks your heart because you're like, well, I don't want my son to lose the zest for learning. Because if you lose your zest for learning, you're losing a big excitement and enthusiasm for life. And I don't want that to happen. But then I'll be with my high school seniors, and we'll do a really engaging project. They'll go and interview World War II veterans and create videos. They'll write poems for a poetry slam that they plan. They'll do something like that, and all of a sudden their eyes light up the same exact way my 4-year-olds do. Are you with me? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They get all fired up, and it's like, wait a minute, there's still like this spark in there, right? There's still this like, what's it called, a pilot light that's just waiting to go off. And I feel like so much of the education system does a lot of things right. I'm a product of it. You're a product of it. We're okay. But there's so much of it that misses, that doesn't do anything to get that pilot light to make a big old flame. To keep a kid's attention, to utilize what they bring to the classroom. And I don't think it's got to be that way. I think there's still ways of having a traditional classroom, where a teacher can go to the front and talk at times, and students still have to sometimes drill and kill. The best way to learn grammar, after the years of being an English teacher, I still feel like the best way to learn grammar is at some point you got to do worksheets, and you got to practice it over and over and over. So I'm not saying you can't have traditional schooling, but that can't be all there is. You've got to find ways to engage kids on another level. You've got to make it fun. I don't care what you teach, you've got to find some way to make learning fun in every single subject. Maybe not all the time, but if a kid says this class was never fun, I would raise my eyebrows to that. I would question that a little bit and ask, why isn't it never fun? Because I want my life to be fun. You probably want your life
Yeah,
to be fun. So
absolutely.
why would we not try to instill that in what we do in the classroom?
All right, so that's kind of a perfect segue to talk about your book, The Epic Classroom. So could you talk a little bit about, first of all, where was that book born from?
Yeah, I love stories. One of my favorite things with my kids is just sitting down and just making up and telling them stories, and they get so engaged with it. Even my 2-year-old daughter doesn't need a book in front of her, a TV screen, or an iPad. She can literally just sit there for half an hour and listen to a story. There's something that about stories that just grab us. Um, Have you seen the movie Dunkirk?
I haven't yet. I've heard it's real.
Christopher Nolan war movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched it last night, and it's visually stunning. It's incredible, but there's not a clear narrative to it. So it's not about a certain soldier who's trying to survive, and it's not about a battle plan. It's really just kind of like a snapshot or a portrait of this war that's going on. And I remember by the end of, and I'm not trying to spoil it for anybody, but by the end, spoiler alert, the Allied forces won World War II. So I gotta break it to you. The Nazis lost. I hate to be the spoiler for the podcast, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Nice.
The Nazis lost. So there's not a clear story to that movie, and it kind of lost me because a good story has this way of grabbing you. And I remember I once saw this TED talk about this phenomenon called neural coupling, and it's about the science of stories and how when you hear a really well told story, your brain physically transforms, and you remember what you heard way better than if you just heard that information as knowledge, as information. This is the way that a lot of textbooks or lectures deliver knowledge. Stories have a way of like really making you retain that knowledge at a very deep level. And so I started thinking about that. And I started thinking about some of the best experiences I had in education and some of the stuff I was doing with my students. And I realized, the units, the projects that were shaped like a story, that had very real conflict that students had to solve, that had distinct beginnings, entry movements that kind of move students into some type of journey where they had to go solve this project. And there was some type of climax to it at the peak of them solving that project. When you do things like that, students really retain the information. They really remember it in a way that a lot of schooling doesn't have the ability to make you remember. A lot of the experience that I had in school and the reason I remember so little like of details of being in classrooms as a kid is I remember learning a bunch of information, putting it down on a test, discarding it, and then getting more and more information, and then discarding it and doing it over and over again until I got out of school. Um, and so the Epic Classroom is really about how do you shape the student's experience into an actual story so that when they think back on that time, it's shaped as a story and they remember it and they're transformed by it.
Well, yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said that the human race as a species, we're genetically programmed. Our ancestors, our farthest back ancestors, that's how they learned. That's the reason so much of our knowledge exists is before there was writing and reading, there was story. That's how our knowledge has been passed down for
Yeah.
millenniums.
What did you see? There's this cave painting in France called Lascaux, and it's 36,000 years old. And archaeologists originally thought that it was just depicting the different animals that were in that part of France 36,000 years ago. But now they've determined by looking at it really closely and finding more and more images that it's actually telling the story of the hunt. So, I mean, that's literally 30,000 years before we could write. We were telling stories. And there's something really like almost innate and powerful and human about stories.
Well, yeah,
So
and
why wouldn't we use that in the classroom?
yeah, and I just you think back to as well. You told the story of your sixth grade teacher, Mr. Peters. I could think back to those stories of, and it was so funny. My sister got married 2 weeks ago, my younger sister, and our high school band director was a huge part of all three of our lives. So there's a story between he and I. So my senior year, our band was successful, and then we moved up a division in marching band, and he was just on us and on us and on us. And this one time we were practicing, and he, in not so many words, and you can insert the right cuss word, told me I didn't know squat, but he used a four-letter
It
word.
started with an S.
Yeah, and you know every time I see him, I still remind him of that day, but it's not just because it was that day. It was because, from that moment, and that the 4 years that I had him, like, it was such a developmental period, and he was, it was in the Marine Corps band, so that gives you kind of an idea of how we operated, and that was such a transformational time in my life. But it was so funny because even I'm now 15 years out of high school. I saw him 2 weeks ago, and he knew that I was gonna get him with it.
Yeah, but I mean, and it was a story for him too, right?
Yeah,
You know, I mean, so
yeah.
I mean, it connected with him in the same way.
Yeah, and it's so funny, and we always remind him of one of his sayings. I don't remember where he got it, but he said when you were doing a really good show, that people would be throwing babies from the stands. And he used to just say that, and every once in a while I hit him with that too. But like you said, we're so hardwired for story, and I mean, and I look at my 3-year-old nephew, and I know with your kids, like, my nephew can have a book, and he will literally ask me or my sister or my brother-in-law to read it 20 times in a row because he wants to hear that story over and over.
Well, just think about like the only time in our lives where like nobody is actually on their phone is when you go to a movie theater. Well, they're not supposed to be on their phone. If they are, I love to like chuck like popcorn, maybe even
Yeah,
a soda at them. But I mean, like you can literally sit there for 3 hours and look in one direction. Like, what is it that can do that to us? That you can literally be that captivated by something. And so, like, I think about like how do we intentionally, and what my book's about is how do we intentionally craft the time into a story. And so, if I've got a set of content standards and I know that my students have to learn this stuff, how can I create real conflict for my students to solve with this? So, um, whether it's starting that business idea, there was something that really motivated students to create these businesses. It was real conflict that unsettled them in a way. And so, at the beginning of that project, I had a guest speaker come in, and that was the beginning of the story. That was the inciting incident in literary terms. That introduced a conflict to my students that wasn't there before, and that disturbed them. That made them want to do something about it. And then, and if you do the proper planning as a teacher, you can figure out what can I do to introduce conflict to my students that's going to make them engaged and go do something about it. Um, and then the rising action of the story is everything that the students are doing to solve that conflict. As a teacher, while they're working on it, whether it's creating businesses, whether it's creating documentaries or PSAs or whatever it is you want to have students make, you can also tie in that content work, like we talked about earlier. There's creativity to teaching, and so finding
right.
ways to tie in whatever it is you have to teach that curriculum into the authentic piece of the classroom. So yeah, I think it's fascinating to tell stories with students. I think there's value in that, but also I think you can take it a step further and actually create stories. So even that at the end of that unit or project or story, you can have students reflect on it, and then they actually tell that story of what they just experienced in your class. And all of a sudden, that neural coupling is happening. Your brain is activated as you remember that story, and what they learn, and even the specifics of the content are being driven down deep. So it's not just forgotten after the test. So it's actually retained.
Right.
I
And
get geeked out about that.
yeah, and I'm hoping we can kind of geek out a little bit more too, because I saw on your blog as well you had a piece about the hero's journey, and it was talking
Yes.
all about the need for messiness and discomfort. So explain a little bit about what the hero's journey is, and why we need to, you said, introduce conflict, create messiness and discomfort for kids.
So there was this mythologist, which is just what a job title. Can you imagine if like your Twitter bio you said like Kyle Kruger mythologist?
It'd be amazing.
Yeah, it's the dream. I'm working towards it. So there was this mythologist named Joseph Campbell, and he studied basically all of the great stories throughout all of human history. From the story of the Odyssey and text from the Bible and Shakespeare, all the way to modern day. Fahrenheit 451 and East of Eden, Grapes of Wrath, Harry Potter. He looked at all of these great stories. I don't know if he looked at Harry Potter or not, but it does fit, and I'll explain it. He looked at all these great stories, and he found that there's a formula to any great story. He calls it the hero's journey. And essentially, every good story, whether the author intended it or not, has a hero that exists in the ordinary world. This is the world that they live in, and whether it's good or bad, this is what it looks like for them. And then something calls them to action. It's the inciting incident. It disrupts their ordinary world. And they have to go on some type of journey to solve whatever it is that disrupted them. And as they go on this journey, they hit obstacles, they run into mentors, or Joseph Campbell calls them guides, and they help lead them in the right direction. They help move them through these obstacles. And then as they're going along, they eventually start to return to the ordinary world, except now they return with what Joseph Campbell calls the gift of the goddess. So the return with the elixir. They come back to the ordinary world now changed. All of their struggles, all of everything they had along that journey, including running into this guide who helped move them along, changed them. So that now they come back to the ordinary world as better. So that next time there's a conflict, they can do something about it. And so if you think about any great story, whether it's the Odyssey, and he gets called away and he has to return back to his home, and he goes through all these perils. Or if you think about Lion King, we've got Simba, who lives in the Pride Lands, and everything's good, and he's got this dad, and he's going to be king someday, and he can't wait, and then all of a sudden his dad dies. His ordinary world is disrupted, and he has to go across the desert, and he runs into Timon and Pumbaa, and they're these guides that help move him towards this better way, and eventually he returns back, and he defeats his uncle, because now he's got the elixir, and he can take on anything in the world. He's transformed by the journey, and you can identify that in any great story you've ever heard, which I think is just brilliant. I think there's something really special about that. So in teaching terms, if we don't disrupt our students' ordinary world, if we don't shake them, if we don't give them real conflict that actually bothers them in some way and makes them want to move into action, how are they ever going to return with the elixir? You know what I mean? Like, how are they ever going to need a guide? If I tell my students, okay, guys, at the beginning of the year, we're going to start in chapter 1 of the textbook. When we're done with chapter 1, we're going to go into chapter 2, and then chapter 3 and chapter 4, and then we're going to take a unit test and blah, 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 blah. At what point are they going to get transformed? When are they going to get that elixir that makes them be able to take on whatever life throws at them? And so, and kind of like I told you earlier with that student Sarah, she's been through her own hero's journey for a long time in her life, and I think a role of a teacher in a student like that, or in really any student, is we're the guides. We're the ones that encounter students along the way. We can help point them in the right direction, maybe offer wisdom, or maybe we can kick their butt sometimes, and give them the discipline or whatever it is that needs to help them move along. So
Yeah.
that's the hero's journey.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I've read the book. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's such a powerful book, and I could look at myself like I left Wisconsin 8 years ago because I couldn't find a job in 15 months of after graduating college. I couldn't find a job, and Houston was the first place that offered me a job. So I went, and grew, and went through all those challenges, and now I'm.
And I have a feeling that during those 15 months, it was not very settling. There was probably a lot of stress.
Yes, it was very.
You felt very good about it.
No, it was very stressful, and I spent a year substitute teaching because I thought, that's what you do. That's what people told me. That was the path.
Sure.
Like, you substitute teach, you get your foot in the door, and I realized very quickly after that year started that was not a life that I wanted to live. So I was like, all right, the first job I get offered, I'm going. I don't care where it is. And it was, and I have so many mentors and so many friends, and and even the journey down there was rough, and it was rough a year ago, saying goodbye to some people that had really become family to me, but I really like what you said there. So in our world, in our so politically charged climate, how are you introducing that disruption or that discomfort to kids when talking about the way our country is right now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've always had a policy that I'm never going to let my politics show in the classroom. I mean, like I want to, because I know as as teachers, we have captive audiences. We know that what we say carries more weight with students than other people. And that's that's a good thing. And so I really, because my students always want to get fired up about certain things, especially my older high school students. They want to talk about the things they've read, or they want to debate all this stuff. And I'm okay with debate, especially giving them space to do it and showing them how do you properly talk about these kind of things. But I'm really intentional about trying to bring positivity to the discussion, not avoiding the darkness in our world. And especially this last year with the school shootings and the deep frustration and fear that students bring after that kind of stuff, and that I bring as a teacher. I don't want to shy away from that stuff, and I don't. But I always try to finish those conversations with hope about, okay, what can we do about this? Okay, yeah, we can talk about it, but what can we actually do about it? If you feel really strongly, student A, if you feel really strongly that we need to ban assault rifles, what can we do about it? Who can you write? Do we just have to settle for it, or can we actually do something about it? Or a student who wants to protect the Second Amendment because he was raised to protect the Second Amendment and all that stuff, okay, that's fine. How do we talk about it with each other? And what do you do about that? Because you have to realize that whatever you think is under attack by somebody else. And so I think you have to learn how to pick those things apart and have good discussions about it. I actually, my principal, who is just awesome, at the beginning of the year, this year and last year, I had him come in, and I just had all the students sit in a big circle in the room, and him and I sat in the middle of the room, and for 30 minutes we had a discussion. And I had some discussion topics in mind, but for 30 minutes, 5 times that day, my principal was awesome and spent the whole day with our class. We just talked, and we modeled really great discussion. We talked about foreign affairs and conflicts. We talked about local stuff and politics, and should we have school uniforms? Should students be drug tested to play sports? We talked about all these different things, and we just modeled what good discussion can look like. And we both played devil's advocate with each other. We never straight up agreed with each other. And we just showed students that, hey, this is what it can look like to actually talk to somebody who you disagree with. And most of the time, the principal and I, we actually aligned on most of those issues. But we didn't show them the discussion. We felt like, you know what, let's show kids, how do you have proper discourse? Because, we have lots of issues in the world, and it's pretty politically charged and ugly at times. But that's nothing new. We've had, I love history. I love diving into fiction and historical fiction. And the world's been a pretty ugly place in not all the time, but a lot of the time. In different areas, and so there's nothing new to the terrible violence and racism and segregation and all these things that we hate. But I do feel like that we're forgetting how to talk about these things. I think we're starting to lose our ability to discuss and debate and have discourse that's healthy and enriching. And so I think teachers, one of our roles, and I don't care what you teach, is to show kids how to do that properly.
Yeah, and I think it's been I know for myself, and I have a teaching partner, it's been a real gut check on, my bias and what I'm bringing in, because this is the first time in my, I've been in school since I was 6 years old, that I at times have genuine fear. Like I have genuine fear for my safety and my kids, and I might think that I'm hiding that fear, but I don't think I am. I know there are times where and there's probably nothing going on, but there are times when my guard goes up and I start to really look around. And I'm like, okay, is something going to happen here? Is something going to, we went.
Hear a door slam in the hallway.
Yeah.
You're like, whoa, why did that door slam? Or why does that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's charged.
And
let me ask you this: Do you feel like it's okay to let students know that you have that fear?
Yeah, we were very open, and I think, and the point I was going to try to make with that discourse is we need to be open about, as teachers, like you said, not making it political, but me expressing the fact that I have genuine fear. I don't think that's a political statement. I think that's more just me in authenticity, being like, hey, and when talking about the gun violence issue, I think we had a breakthrough just all of us being able to say, like, to some degree, we all fear something. Like, those Second Amendment people fear losing their guns. The other, people fear. And I thought that was just a piece of discourse that we did well just this year with our kids.
Yeah, and then like you said, like I don't think teachers we ever have to lie. If a student asks us, like I'll have a student come in and say, like, "Hey, did you see what the president tweeted? What do you think about that?" I'm not gonna lie. I'm be like, "Oh, that disgusted me." I'm sorry you had to hear that. I had a student who was in my class last year who literally left our school because how she was treated because she is from Mexico. And she used to wear her poncho in the hallway and proudly wear it and talk about her heritage. And kids would like chant things to her like we're gonna build the wall. And like I remember one day that a bunch of kids got suspended from school because of that happening. And kids asked me like, "How do you think about that?" And I'm like, "I'll tell you exactly how I think about that. I think it's disgusting." And when I heard students try, and when I had students try to say something about it, like, well, maybe she shouldn't wear that poncho in the hallway. I got no problem as a teacher either, challenging on that and making them justify that. So yeah, I don't know if that's wrong or right, but I feel like in my experience, I think it's okay to speak the truth to things I feel deeply convicted about. Again, not inserting politics, not telling kids that what their parents think is wrong or they think is wrong. But if I feel a conviction about something that I feel like is not making the world a better place, I feel like it's okay to get the discussion going.
Yeah, I think we had a conversation. I had some students ask me recently, did you see the video of the lawyer in New York who was in a deli and started screaming about how people, and, we were talking, they asked me about that. I'm like, and the point was made, we don't have a national language.
Yep.
English is not our national language, and for me, they kind of want to know my perspective because I lived in Houston for 8 years,
Sure.
where of if it's not a majority, then it's very close to being a 50-50 split of people that speak Spanish, and a ton of kids that I taught were English language, that that Spanish was their first language. And I just kind of said, like, yeah, I think that guy's crazy. And we talked a little bit, and they said, because the videos came out, that wasn't the first time he'd had a rant like that. So I really like what you said too, because I think our kids need to be challenged on things like that. If you're not going to challenge them with their views, or I think you have to challenge them in different arenas.
Yep. Yeah, and I love playing devil's advocate with students. And so sometimes my kids are like, "You're so confusing. Are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Are you conservative? Are you liberal? Like I can't figure you out." Like, well, that's good. I like that. I like to be able to push from all different sides. But I do think that when it comes to something like that, I've got quite a few different ESL students in my class. Some from Spain, from some Mexico, Central America, South America. I want those students to know that at least in my class, you have somebody who values you as much as anybody else. That you do not have to hide your heritage from me, and I want every kid in the room to know that I feel that way. So it's not preaching to me; it's saying out loud that in this room, this is the way it's going to be, and I hope that you would see the world this way as well.
Yeah, and just along that point too, another kind of conversation we have is I'm in small town Wisconsin, about 10,000 people, predominantly white, but we're about 45 minutes from Minneapolis, St. Paul, so we do get an influx of a few African American students, and we had a long conversation because one of our African American students was really offended that there were not only other African American students using the N word, but she was continually hearing white kids use the N word, and she was borderline getting her, like, she was going to get herself in trouble one of these times because every time she was hearing it, she was reacting with a little bit more anger, and she just was so upfront and was just like, you don't get to choose what that word means, because there's a lot of kids that say, well, oh, my friend is black, so it's okay, I say it around him.
Sure.
And we had to have the conversation of, and we really were able to tie it into, the way social media works is, just because you intend a word to have a certain meaning doesn't mean that everybody's gonna know that that's the meaning you wanted to have. And those are some of the conversations, I think, like you said, and going back to what you said, with the team building, that when you have that atmosphere, you can have those kind of conversations without, making it political.
Well, and so like I said, I even if you told students, hey, this is what you should think, that's bad that you do that, blah blah blah, that will go in one ear and out the other for so many students. Being told what to think on something. I think a lot of people think that teachers are just out trying to put their worldview on students, and I don't think that's what effective teachers do anyway. But I do think that when students have real conversations that are productive, if you had students and this was happening and you say, hey, let's talk about this. Why might this be a problem? Why do you think one of these students might have a real big problem with a white person using the N-word? Usually at the end of those discussions, there's a consensus that's formed. That where students at least can gain empathy for how somebody else is feeling. Um, when Parkland happened, uh, we had a really long 5-day discussion. We made time to talk about it for a whole week, and um, by the end of it, I remember I had this one student in class who like 17 for his birthday gift, he got 2 assault rifles crossed onto his arm, tattooed, just straight up Second Amendment kid, loves his guns. Um, and he was he was the antithesis to most of my students who were like, why do we need these guns? Why do we keep having school shootings using these high-powered rifles? Um, and I kind of I would ask questions, but more than anything, I just gave us space for the conversation to unfold. And I would make sure it never got too heated. I'd let students turn up the notch a little bit, but I also said, okay, hey, let's pause and make sure we're hearing everybody. Let's make sure we're staying respectful. And I can tell you by the end of it, that student was, he naturally said, yeah, you know what, maybe we don't need all of this. Maybe maybe we can tighten up background checks or something like that. That student came to that conclusion not because I came up in the front of class and said, hey, look at the stats, look at all this, look what bump stocks are, look blah blah blah. He did it because he had a conversation, a good conversation where he was listened to, and others listened to him, and eventually he came to that conclusion. So as I think about as a teacher and what other teachers can do, um, to make sure that students leave their classes um, better people, I don't think it's standing up front saying everything you believe. I think it's creating space for good conversations to unfold, um, and kind of pointing students in a direction where they can have those conversations.
Absolutely. So, yeah. I mean, we could have a conversation about that, for till kingdom
That's
come.
a
But
separate podcast.
yeah. But I definitely want to be respectful of your time. So I do have a few questions to finish up with. First, I gotta say I'm excited. Me and my normal co-host, who is in the throes of a doctoral program, so he's a little busy right now to co-host with me. We're both going to be in Vegas at Teach Your Heart Out, which I'm really looking forward to. So,
Nice.
can you just talk a little bit about what people can expect at Teach Your Heart Out, and specifically what you're presenting on?
Yes. Oh, Teach Your Heart Out is a blast. I just did the keynote for that in March. Um, and it's a celebration of teachers, and that's why I love it so much. I go to a lot of different conferences speaking, um, and I always have a great time. And there's always teachers there, but a lot of conferences teachers are there because they have to get PD credits, or because they're being made to go to the conference, or they're there for tech training, which is all good, or maybe they're going for a specific type of pedagogy, which is great. Teach Your Heart Out is really about celebrating good teaching. There's some really great teachers there who, just share about some of the stuff they do. And sometimes it does go into specifics, which is great, but it's always kind of a spin that, teachers are phenomenal people. And here's some ways to just do your work better, but also thanks for the work you do. So let's have a huge party to celebrate it. So it's one of the funnest conferences I've ever done. I'm doing the one in Vegas as well. and it's just a blast. So I'm going to my keynote is about the power of story. So I'm going to just tell stories and talk about how we can apply that and do it all in the classroom. So it's a really good time.
Awesome. We're looking
I'm
forward.
excited you're going to be there. That's fine.
Yeah, man, we're really looking forward to it, and we are on board for the cruise next summer, which I'm just
Love it.
over the moon about. So that's going to be awesome as well.
Oh,
So,
I had to turn that one down.
oh no.
I know. Yeah, I've already got some speaking gigs, two of them that week. So I had to turn down going on a cruise, and that makes me sick to my stomach.
It'll be good. So, all right. Few final questions here. What's the best advice you've ever been given, and that can be within teaching or outside?
Best advice I've ever been given. This might not be the best advice, but I tell you what, as a teacher, this has been really, really useful advice. I remember I was really struggling because in my first year of teaching, I was big, I was exciting, I wanted to pour everything into my classroom, so I brought this energy every single day, and the kids loved it. They ate up the energy that I brought, and that a lot of first year teachers brought or bring. And but there was a big group of students who really took advantage of that energy. They thought, oh, because he's so much fun, we can really kind of do whatever we want. And I remember it really started beating me down because I kind of lost control of my first class ever. It was like something got away from me and I wasn't able to reel it back in. And even at the end of that year, I never felt like I got this class to where I wanted. And a mentor of mine, who's a former assistant principal, he reached out when I wrote a blog about struggling with this. He said, I always tell students this. He says, don't mistake my kindness for weakness. So don't mistake my kindness for weakness. So it's telling students, and again, this isn't the best advice I was ever given, like my favorite, but it is very, very useful for a teacher like me. We can have a lot of fun, and you can love my class, and I can love you, and you can love me, and we can do these amazing things. But don't get confused with the idea that I still need you to learn. I still need you to work hard, and I still need you to respect me. And I'm not your best friend. And once we draw that line, we can do amazing things. And so I really took that advice to heart. I don't think I'd still be a teacher right now if I never heard that advice because I think I would have gotten burned out. So
Right.
that advice has allowed me to do a lot of other things.
Right. Awesome. All right. So the best thing you've read in the last year?
Like teacher books or
Any
anything.
any any book.
So I read it 5 years ago, and then I read it again this year. It's the book East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Have you read it?
I haven't.
Oh, before I see you in June in Vegas, I would love for you to tell me what the big word out of that book is. It'll make sense when you read it. Anybody that's read East of Eden knows what I'm talking about. I
Okay.
got it tattooed on my arm last month. It's
Big
that good.
big word. Okay. So sounds like I'm gonna find this big word, and then we're going to get matching. I'm gonna get a matching tattoo when I'm in
Perfect.
Vegas. All right.
Yeah, so East of Eden will rock your world.
Okay. Got it. Before Vegas, I can make that happen. That's a month away.
It's 600 words, so don't overcommit.
Nice. All right. Your proudest accomplishment to date that can be within teaching or outside.
Gosh, I love being a dad. I always dreamed of being a dad. Um, I I I love my dad, but it wasn't. I never felt like it was everything you wanted it to be as a kid. And so now that I've got kids, I screw up all the time and I lack so much. But I just love the challenge of every day trying to figure out how can I be a better dad to these kids? How can I set them up so they have just phenomenal adventurous lives? So that's a pretty big accomplishment to have these two kids right now.
Awesome. Yeah.
And I got a tattoo. That's my other big accomplishment.
Nice. Yeah. I'm still working on, finding the right person before the dad thing comes in,
Yeah,
but I can
hugely important.
yeah, I can even say just, like I told you I have an almost 3-year-old nephew and almost 1-year-old nephew and just the mind shift change for me with those guys has been huge.
Oh, doesn't it? And three is such a fun age, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, we were about a month ago. We had my dad's 60th birthday, and there's this book that my nephew really likes. I don't remember which one it was, and we were like, "Hey, Beckett, will you read through this book with us?" And he goes, "Oh, no, no, I can't. I'm just too nervous." And
Too
I
nervous.
just look at him like, I don't know how you know how to say that. So, all right. Before we ask you the final question, people want to connect with you, follow you. What's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can follow me on Facebook. My Facebook page is called the Epic Classroom. I make a bunch of videos and I write and I put a bunch of stuff on there. So you can go to the Epic Classroom on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at Trevor Muir or on Instagram at the Epic Classroom. So would love to connect with you there though.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I appreciate your time, sir. And like I said, I wish we had more time. Maybe we'll have to see if we can sneak some time in Vegas and sit down
Love it.
and keep the conversation going. So, last question: what do you want your legacy to be?
I want I want every student, whoever comes into my classroom, to know that they were cared for. Um, I want them all to feel like that that somebody loved them. A lot of my students come from homes where I'm sure they're loved in some way, but they don't always feel it. And there's a lot of different circumstances for why that happened. Um, but I think every teacher can, at the very least, let a kid knows that somebody knows their name, that somebody cares about them. And I think it's something we're all capable of doing. And I don't think it's big, extravagant acts to do that. So I want to live out every day letting the people I spend all my time with, which right now it's a bunch of students, um, I just want them to know that they are cared for.
Awesome, Trevor Muir. Thanks for coming on the podcast, buddy.
Hey, it was fun.